He had the wrong eye color, the wrong accent, and he was nearly a decade too old. Yet, Frédéric Bourdin, a French con man, convinced a grieving Texas family and the FBI that he was their long-lost teenage son. He didn't just steal an identity, he stepped into a life, and in doing so, he may have uncovered a mystery far darker than his own deception. This is the unbelievable true story of the imposter, a man who craved a family so desperately he was willing to steal one. Welcome to the dark chapters. There are criminals who steal money, and there are those who steal lives. But Frédéric Bourdin was something else entirely. He was a thief of identity, a phantom who could slip into the skin of another person, wearing their name and their history like a costume. For decades, he was a ghost, a chameleon who drifted across Europe, assuming dozens of false identities, conning his way into orphanages, schools, and the lives of unsuspecting strangers. He was not motivated by greed or violence, but by something far more fundamental and desperate. A lifelong, unquenchable craving for the love, acceptance, and sense of belonging he had been denied since birth. His life was a masterclass in deception, a long and bizarre journey that would see him transform from a lonely, unwanted boy into a master of disguise, culminating in an act of breathtaking audacity, convincing a grieving American family that he was their long-lost son. The making of a master imposter began in the bleak suburbs of Paris, France, in 1974. Frédéric Bourdin's life started with a rejection. He was the child of a brief affair between his young French mother and a married Algerian immigrant father who wanted nothing to do with him. From the moment he was born, he was an outsider, a child of two worlds who belonged to neither. He never knew his father. His mother, unable or unwilling to care for him, sent him to live with his grandparents in a poor, rough neighborhood. His childhood was one of neglect and isolation. He was a boy with dark features and a French name, a constant target for bullies, a stray cat in a world that seemed to have no place for him. It was in this harsh environment that the young Bourdin discovered his unique and powerful talent. He learned that he could survive by becoming whatever people needed him to be. He became a gifted liar, not out of malice, but out of a desperate need to invent a life more palatable than his own. He would tell other children fantastic stories about his parents, painting pictures of a loving, wealthy family that existed only in his imagination. He discovered that if he told a lie with enough conviction, with enough detail, people would believe him. This was the first lesson in his education as a con man. Reality is negotiable. He also learned that he had an uncanny ability to mimic others. He had a keen ear for accents and a knack for picking up on subtle mannerisms and physical tics. He could change his posture, his walk, his voice, subtly transforming his physical presence to match the persona he was trying to project. This, combined with his dark, vaguely ethnic features that made his origins difficult to place, gave him a remarkable ability to appear as though he could be from anywhere. He could be Spanish, he could be Italian, he could be Portuguese. He was a blank canvas onto which any identity could be painted. As a teenager, his life of deception began in earnest. He ran away from home and began a nomadic existence, drifting across Europe. He had no money, no papers, no future. His only asset was his talent for becoming someone else. His primary targets were institutions designed to help the vulnerable, orphanages, shelters for runaway teens, and schools. He discovered a simple but effective formula. He would claim to be a lost or abandoned teenager, often from another country, a victim of a tragic fabricated backstory. He found that authorities were often so eager to help a child in need that they would overlook inconsistencies in his story. His youth, or at least the appearance of it, was his greatest weapon. For years, he perfected his craft. He would show up in a Spanish town, claiming to be a French orphan who had lost his parents in a car crash. The local authorities, taking pity on the traumatized boy, would place him in a children's home. There he would receive food, shelter, and a temporary sense of belonging. He would play the role perfectly, but eventually his true age would be discovered, or the lie would unravel. Before he could be exposed, he would simply vanish, slip away in the night, and reappear in another country with a new name, a new accent, and a new tragic story. He was, at various times, Jimmy, a boy from the Isle of Wight, Francisco, a Portuguese orphan, and dozens of other lost souls. He spent time in over 15 countries, creating more than 30 false identities. He became so adept at his deceptions that he once managed to fool German authorities for weeks into believing he was a teenage boy who had been raised in the jungle by a reclusive cult. He was a master of improvisation, able to spin elaborate, convincing lies on the spot, weaving together details that were just plausible enough to be believed. But this life on the run, this constant cycle of deception and discovery, was taking its toll. By 1997, Frédéric Bourdin was 23 years old, but he was still playing the part of a teenager. The older he got, the harder the charade became to maintain. He was exhausted, lonely, and no closer to finding the permanent sense of family and identity he craved. The brief moments of acceptance he found in orphanages were always fleeting, always built on a foundation of lies that was destined to collapse. He was trapped in a cycle of his own making, a perpetual adolescent running from his own shadow. It was in a youth shelter in Spain, in the autumn of 1997, that he stumbled upon the idea for his greatest and most audacious impersonation. He was running out of options. He knew that his time pretending to be a European teenager was coming to an end. He needed a new identity, one that was more secure, one that came with a ready-made family that would not question his arrival. He called an American hotline for missing children, posing as a Spanish shelter official. He asked if they had any records of missing American boys who had vanished several years earlier. An operator gave him a name, Nicholas Barclay, a 13-year-old boy with blue eyes and blonde hair who had disappeared from his home in San Antonio, Texas, 3 years earlier, in 1994. The physical description could not have been more different. Bourdin was 23, with brown eyes and dark hair, but these were mere details to a man like him. In the name Nicolas Barclay, Frédéric Bourdin saw the opportunity of a lifetime. This wasn't about finding a temporary home in an orphanage. This was a chance to steal a real life, to step into the shoes of a missing boy and claim the family, the history, and the love that came with him. It was an impossibly bold, almost insane plan. It would require him to fool not just the authorities, but a grieving family desperate to believe their son had come home. It was the ultimate test of his skills, the grandest stage for his deception. In that moment, the French chameleon decided to become an American boy. In the sterile confines of a Spanish youth shelter, Frédéric Bourdin, the 23-year-old chameleon, held the key to his most audacious performance yet, the name of a missing American boy. Nicholas Barclay, 13 years old, blonde hair, blue eyes, a boy who had vanished without a trace from San Antonio, Texas, 3 years prior. The physical discrepancies were not just significant, they were a chasm. Bourdin was a decade older, with dark hair, brown eyes, and the unmistakable accent of a Frenchman. To attempt such an impersonation was not just bold, it was an act of profound, almost psychopathic arrogance. But Bourdin's entire life had been an exercise in making the impossible seem plausible. He didn't see the obstacles, he saw an opportunity for the one thing he craved above all else: a real family, a real identity, a place to finally belong. His plan began with a series of masterful manipulations. Posing as a Spanish official from the youth shelter, he contacted the authorities in Texas. He told them a stunning story. A terrified, traumatized boy had been found wandering the streets, a boy who claimed to be the missing Nicholas Barclay. Bourdin, as the official, then began to lay the groundwork for explaining the glaring physical differences. He spun a horrific, elaborate tale that was just plausible enough to be believed in a world that was becoming increasingly aware of international child trafficking. He claimed the boy had been kidnapped by a sophisticated, military-style pedophile ring, smuggled to Europe, and subjected to years of unspeakable physical and psychological abuse. This, he explained, was why the boy's memory was fragmented, why he seemed so different. The trauma had changed him. To account for the most obvious inconsistencies, the eyes and hair, Bourdin invented a chilling detail. He claimed the boy's captors had chemically altered his appearance, dyeing his hair and using special eye drops to change the color of his irises to keep him from being recognized. He said the boy now spoke with a strange accent because he had been forbidden from speaking English for years. It was a grotesque, theatrical lie, but it was delivered with the calm authority of a concerned professional. And for a family and a set of authorities desperate for a miracle, it was a narrative they were willing to consider. The news reached the Barclay family like a lightning bolt. For 3 years, they had lived in the agonizing limbo of not knowing. The phone call from Spain, relayed through the U.S. Embassy, was a shock to their system. The first family member to speak with the boy on the phone was Nicholas's older sister, Carrie. The voice on the other end of the line was not the one she remembered. It was older, deeper, with a strange European accent, but this strange boy on the phone knew things. Bourdin, a master of gleaning information, had already started to piece together details about the family. He spoke of his mom, of San Antonio, and most powerfully, he sounded scared and lost. Carrie, her heart overwhelmed by a tidal wave of hope and grief, wanted to believe. The hope of seeing her brother again was a force more powerful than the nagging voice of logic. The wheels of international bureaucracy began to turn, greased by the powerful emotions of the case. U.S. Embassy officials in Spain met with the boy. They were met with a master class in acting. Bourdin hunched his shoulders. He kept his eyes downcast. He spoke in terrified whispers. He refused to be photographed, claiming his captors would see the picture and come for him. He was the very picture of a traumatized victim. The officials, faced with a grieving family on one side and a seemingly terrified child on the other, did not conduct the rigorous identity checks that might have been expected. Fingerprints were taken, but a definitive match to the young Nicholas was not immediately found or pursued with vigor. In an era before mandatory DNA testing for such cases, the process relied heavily on visual identification and circumstance. The family's emotional desire for this to be true became the most powerful piece of evidence. The decision was made. Nicholas Barclay was coming home. His sister, Carrie, boarded a plane and flew to Spain to bring back the brother she had thought was lost forever. The first face-to-face meeting was the ultimate test of Bourdin's deception. In a small room in Spain, he sat huddled in a corner, wearing a baseball cap pulled low over his face and a scarf wrapped around his neck, a physical manifestation of his supposed trauma. When Carrie entered, she saw not the brother she remembered, but a stranger. A taller, older boy with dark eyes and a 5 o'clock shadow. But then he spoke in that same scared foreign accent, and he looked at her with what she interpreted as the terrified eyes of her brother. The power of suggestion, fueled by 3 years of desperate hope, was absolute. She broke down, she hugged him, and in that moment, she accepted him. Frédéric Bourdin had crossed the threshold. He had his first believer. The long flight back to Texas was an intelligence-gathering mission for Bourdin. He listened intently as Carrie, overjoyed and emotional, shared stories of their family, of Nicholas's childhood, his friends, his favorite foods, the names of his pets. She was unknowingly providing him with the script for the rest of his life. He absorbed every detail, committing it to memory, building the character of Nicholas Barclay from the inside out. He used his trauma as a shield, claiming not to remember much, forcing Carrie to fill in the blanks, which she did eagerly. The arrival in San Antonio was a scene of raw, overwhelming emotion. His mother, Beverly, and other family members were waiting. When they saw him, they too were confronted with the shocking physical differences. But he was their Nicky, returned from the dead. They hugged him, they cried, they welcomed him home. They explained away the changes as the brutal scars of his ordeal. They needed to believe that this was their son. Their collective grief and hope created a powerful reality distortion field, a space where a 23-year-old French con man could be seen as a 16-year-old Texan boy. Frédéric Bourdin had done it. He had stepped out of his own life and into another's. He moved into Nicholas's old bedroom. He was given Nicholas's social security number. He enrolled in the local high school, a 23-year-old man sitting in classes with teenagers. He played the part to perfection. He was quiet, withdrawn, and skittish, all behaviors easily explained by his horrific backstory. He now had what he had always craved: a family, a home, a history. The French chameleon, the master of disguise, was, for all intents and purposes, Nicholas Barclay. His greatest deception was a success. But a lie of this magnitude is a fragile thing, and as he settled into his new life, the cracks in his perfect facade were already beginning to show, and a far darker, more complex mystery about what really happened to the real Nicholas Barclay was about to emerge. For 5 months, Frédéric Bourdin lived a stolen life. He woke up each morning in the bedroom of a boy who had vanished, surrounded by posters and possessions that were not his. He was called Nicky by a woman he called Mom. He ate breakfast at a family table in San Antonio, Texas, a world away from the bleak French suburbs of his youth. He had done it. He had achieved the impossible. But the dream, once realized, proved to be a fragile and deeply unsettling prison. Living as Nicholas Barclay was not a simple performance. It was a tightrope walk over a chasm of lies, and with every passing day, the rope was beginning to fray. His new life was a study in surreal absurdity. At 23 years old, he was enrolled as a sophomore at the local high school. He walked the hallways with teenagers, sat in classrooms learning algebra and history, a grown man in a world of children. He used his trauma as a shield, explaining his accent and his strange, world-weary demeanor as the scars of his captivity. He was quiet, withdrawn, and observant, constantly gathering new details to bolster his character. His teachers and classmates found him odd, but the dramatic story of his kidnapping and miraculous return was a powerful narrative, and most were willing to accept the inconsistencies. Inside the Barclay home, the dynamic was even more complex. He was living with Nicholas's mother, Beverly, a woman hardened by a difficult life, and his sister, Carrie, the one who had brought him home. He studied old family photographs, trying to learn the face of the boy he was supposed to be. He listened intently to family stories, absorbing the memories of a childhood he had never lived. The family, for their part, seemed to engage in a form of collective self-deception. They navigated around the glaring inconsistencies, the dark eyes instead of blue, the French accent, the fact that he looked and acted so much older than the 16 years Nicholas would have been. They attributed every strangeness to the horrific abuse he had supposedly endured. Their need for Nicholas to be alive was so powerful that it blinded them to the stranger living in their midst. But a lie of this magnitude cannot be sustained forever. The cracks began to show. The first person to have serious professional doubts was a local private investigator named Charlie Parker. Parker had worked missing persons cases for years and had a finely tuned sense for when a story didn't add up. He was hired by the producers of a TV news magazine show, Hard Copy, which was interested in producing a segment on the miraculous return of Nicholas Barclay. Parker began his investigation with a healthy dose of skepticism. He started with the physical evidence. He obtained a photograph of the new Nicholas and compared it to photographs of the real Nicholas Barclay from before he disappeared. The differences were obvious, but it was one specific detail that caught Parker's expert eye. The ears. Like fingerprints, the structure of the human ear, the specific whorls and folds of the cartilage, is unique to every individual. Parker looked at the ears of the real Nicholas and the ears of the man pretending to be him. They were not just different, they were fundamentally, anatomically, irreconcilably different. No amount of trauma or abuse could change the basic structure of a person's ears. For Charlie Parker, this was the moment the entire story collapsed. This was not Nicholas Barclay. Armed with this certainty, Parker began to dig deeper. He spoke to teachers at the high school who confirmed their own private doubts about the boy's age and peculiar accent. He then approached the family, but when he presented his doubts to them, he was met not with curiosity, but with fierce defensive hostility. Carrie and Beverly closed ranks, insisting that this was their Nicky, that Parker was a cruel man trying to sensationalize their family's tragedy. Their denial was absolute, almost aggressive. Parker found their reaction strange. A family who had truly found their long-lost son should have welcomed any process that would definitively prove his identity. The Barkers' fierce resistance to scrutiny was, to Parker, a massive red flag. As Parker's investigation continued, Frédéric Bourdin himself became aware that the net was closing in. He could feel the suspicion from Parker and from some of the television producers. His initial euphoria at having found a family began to curdle into paranoia. He knew the lie was unsustainable. But Frédéric Bourdin was a survivor, a master manipulator who had spent his entire life turning situations to his advantage. And it was here, backed into a corner, that he made his most brilliant and diabolical move. He decided to change the narrative. He decided to become the accuser. He sought out Charlie Parker and the TV producers and began to spin a new, even darker story. He admitted he was not Nicholas Barclay, but he claimed that the reason the Barclay family had so readily accepted him was not because they were blinded by hope, but because they had a terrible secret to hide. He began to suggest that the real Nicholas Barclay was dead and that members of his own family were involved in his... He hinted that Nicholas had been a troubled, violent kid and that an altercation with his mother or brother had led to his accidental death and a subsequent cover-up. He claimed that the family had accepted him, a stranger, to keep the authorities from reopening the investigation into what really happened to their son. This was a masterful, manipulative twist. Bourdin transformed himself from the perpetrator of a hoax into a victim of a far more sinister conspiracy. He was no longer just an imposter, he was a witness. He claimed he was now afraid for his own life, trapped in a house with people who might have been responsible for a murder. This new theory was shocking, but it provided a chillingly plausible explanation for the family's bizarre behavior. Their refusal to question the obvious physical differences, their hostility toward Parker's investigation. Suddenly, the focus shifted from Bourdin's deception to a much more terrifying question. What happened to the real Nicholas Barclay? The family home, which had been Bourdin's sanctuary, now became a claustrophobic stage for a tense psychological drama. Bourdin was watching the family, and he knew they were watching him. The authorities, prompted by Parker, were now looking at the case in a completely new light. The FBI was brought in. They needed definitive proof. They secured a court order to obtain fingerprints and a DNA sample from the man calling himself Nicholas Barclay. For Frédéric Bourdin, the imposter, the game was finally up. His time inside the American family was coming to a close, but not before he had cracked open a Pandora's box of secrets and suspicion, leaving behind a mystery far darker and more profound than his own elaborate deception. The final act of Frédéric Bourdin's performance as Nicholas Barclay did not end with a slow fade, but with the harsh, unflinching glare of federal law enforcement. The court order was issued. The time for games was over. FBI agents, accompanied by the now vindicated private investigator Charlie Parker, arrived to execute the order. They took the man they knew as Nicholas to be fingerprinted and to provide a DNA sample. For Bourdin, the master manipulator, this was the moment the stage lights were cut. The intricate set he had built over 5 months was about to be struck down. But even as his world was collapsing, he clung to his final, most diabolical role, not that of the imposter, but that of the terrified witness to a crime far darker than his own. Faced with the inevitability of scientific proof, Bourdin made his final strategic move. He confessed. But he did it on his own terms, controlling the narrative to the very end. In a sterile federal office, the story tumbled out. He admitted he was not Nicholas Barclay. He revealed his true name, Frédéric Bourdin, and his true age, 23. He recounted his life as a chameleon, a perpetual runaway who had spent years conning his way across Europe. He explained, with a strange mixture of pride and detachment, how he had discovered the name of the missing Texas boy and orchestrated the entire elaborate hoax from a youth shelter in Spain. He detailed how he had lied to the embassy, how he had manipulated Nicholas's sister, Carrie, and how he had fooled an entire family and community. The first truth had broken out. The returned boy was a fraud. The confession sent a shockwave through the investigation. Charlie Parker felt a grim sense of vindication. His instincts, his meticulous comparison of the years had been right all along. The family's hostility, the boy's strange demeanor, it all made sense now. But for the FBI, solving one mystery had only thrown them headfirst into a far more disturbing one. They now had to reckon with the second part of Bourdin's story, the sinister accusation he had planted like a landmine before his own identity imploded, that the Barclay family had accepted him not because they were gullible, but because they were complicit in a cover-up of the real Nicholas's death. The news exploded into a media firestorm that dwarfed the initial story of Nicholas's miraculous return. The headlines were a whiplash of sensationalism. Returned boy an imposter. Friend con man fools FBI and family. The public was captivated by the sheer audacity of the deception. Frédéric Bourdin became an instant international celebrity, a figure of bizarre anti-hemo worship. He was the man who had fooled everyone. But as the details of his accusations against the Barclay family began to leak out, the tone of the story shifted from the bizarre to the truly sinister. The focus of the FBI's investigation turned squarely on the Barclay family. Their every action was now re-examined through a lens of deep suspicion. Why had they so readily accepted a boy who looked nothing like their son? Why did they not question the brown eyes, the French accent, the 5 o'clock shadow? Why had they been so hostile to Charlie Parker's investigation? Bourdin's theory provided a chillingly coherent, if monstrous, explanation for their behavior. Investigators began to dig into the past of the real Nicholas Barclay, and the picture that emerged was far from that of an innocent, happy-go-lucky teenager. Nicholas was a troubled kid. He had a juvenile criminal record, a history of difficult and aggressive behavior, and he frequently clashed with his mother, Beverly. On the night he disappeared in 1994, He had been in a heated argument with his family and had stormed out of the house. He was last seen playing basketball at a neighborhood park. He had threatened to run away before. His family initially believed he had simply followed through on his threat. But as the years passed with no contact, that hope had faded. Now the FBI was forced to consider a far darker possibility. Bourdin's claims, though coming from a pathological liar, began to seem horribly plausible. Had an argument on that night in 1994 escalated? Had there been a physical altercation that ended in tragedy? Had the family, in a moment of panic, covered up an accidental death? The FBI now had to treat the Barclay home not as the scene of a hoax, but as a potential crime scene. The search for Nicholas Barclay was officially reclassified from a missing person case to a criminal investigation, with a strong possibility of homicide. For the Barclay family, the turn of events was a second, more vicious nightmare. They had been the victims of a cruel and intimate deception, welcoming a stranger into their home who had preyed upon their deepest hopes. Now, in a dizzying turn, they found themselves as the primary suspects in the potential murder of their own son. They were hounded by the media, viewed with suspicion by their own community. They vehemently denied Bourdin's accusations, insisting they had been blinded by their desperate love for their son, that they had willed themselves to see Nicholas where a stranger stood. But their denials were now viewed with skepticism. The imposter had successfully poisoned the well, and the family was trapped in the web of suspicion he had spun. While the cloud of the murder investigation hung over the Barclays, the legal consequences for Frédéric Bourdin were straightforward. He was arrested and charged not with kidnapping, but with passport fraud and perjury. In 1998, he pleaded guilty and was sentenced to 6 years in federal prison. It was a lenient sentence for a crime that had caused so much emotional devastation and had triggered such a massive, multi-agency investigation. The imposter was caught, his game was over, but his final act of manipulation had been a resounding success. He had not only found a temporary home, but he had also managed to deflect the full weight of the consequences by turning the spotlight of suspicion onto his victims. The truth had broken out, but it was a fractured, incomplete truth. The identity of the man in their home was known, but the fate of the boy he had pretended to be was now a deeper mystery than ever before. Frédéric Bourdin, the liar, had been exposed, but in his final performance he may have accidentally, or brilliantly, stumbled upon a terrible American secret, leaving behind a family shattered by both his presence and his absence, and a cold case that was now burning with the dark possibility of murder. The conviction of Frédéric Bourdin for passport fraud and perjury was not the end of the story. It was merely the end of a single bizarre chapter. Sentenced to 6 years in a federal prison, the French chameleon was finally caged. But even behind bars, Bourdin continued to manipulate his own narrative. He was no longer a frightened runaway, but a celebrity criminal, a figure of international fascination. He granted interviews, corresponded with journalists, and reveled in the notoriety he had created. He was the imposter, the man who had fooled the FBI, and he played the part with a practiced, almost charming lack of remorse. His imprisonment was not a period of quiet reflection, but a masterclass in public relations, cementing his legacy as a legendary conman. While Bourdin cultivated his new persona in prison, the Barclay family was trapped in a very different kind of hell. They were the victims of an almost unimaginable emotional violation, yet the cloud of suspicion that Bourdin had so cleverly seeded refused to dissipate. The FBI, forced to investigate the possibility of homicide, subjected the family to intense scrutiny. Their lives were picked apart, their histories examined. Though no evidence was ever found to suggest they were involved in Nicholas's disappearance, and no charges were ever filed, the damage was done. In the court of public opinion, their desperate, grief-stricken acceptance of an imposter was twisted into something sinister. They were hounded by the media and ostracized by many in their own community. The imposter had been sent to prison, but the Barclay family was sentenced to a life of lingering suspicion, their personal tragedy forever entangled with the dark questions Bourdin had raised. The case of what happened to the real Nicholas Barclay remains cold to this day, a permanent, unsolved wound. Upon his release from prison in the early 2000s, Frédéric Bourdin was deported back to France. He was now a free man, but he was also infamous. One might have expected him to slip back into the shadows, to adopt a new identity and disappear. But Bourdin did the opposite. He leaned into his fame. He became a public figure, a walking, talking mystery. His story was so outlandish that it attracted the attention of filmmakers, leading to the creation of the critically acclaimed 2012 documentary, The Imposter. In the film, Bourdin sits before the camera and recounts his life story with the compelling, manipulative charisma that had become his trademark. He is charming, witty, and at times seemingly vulnerable. He speaks of his lonely childhood, his desperate search for love, and presents his decades of deception not as a series of malicious crimes, but as the desperate actions of a lost boy searching for a family. He masterfully controls his own story, painting himself as a tragic, almost sympathetic figure. The film brilliantly captures the central enigma of Bourdin. Even when you know you are listening to a pathological liar, you cannot help but be drawn in by his performance. And then, the ultimate twist in the story of the man who craved a family. He started one of his own. In France, he met a woman named Isabelle, who knew of his past but fell in love with him anyway. They married and, over the years, have had several children. On the surface, Frédéric Bourdin finally achieved the one thing he had been chasing his entire life. He became a husband and a father. He lives a quiet domestic life in the French countryside, a world away from the orphanages and police stations that had once been his home. He posts happy family photos on social media, presenting the image of a man completely reformed, a chameleon who has finally found his true colors. This brings us to the final unanswerable question of his story. Redemption? Can a man who built his entire existence on a foundation of lies truly find it? Is this new life, the wife, the children, the quiet domesticity, genuine? Or is it simply his greatest, most elaborate, and most long-lasting impersonation? There are two ways to view the final chapter of Frédéric Bourdin. One is the story of a man who, after a lifetime of searching, finally found the love and stability that healed the wounds of his childhood. In this version, the love of his own family gave him the identity he never had, allowing him to finally stop running, to stop pretending. It is a story of hope, suggesting that even the most broken people can be remade by love and responsibility. But there is another, more unsettling interpretation. Perhaps this life as a family man is just another role, the most challenging and rewarding one he has ever played. A master performer never stops performing. It's possible that he is simply applying his unique skills to the part of loving husband and devoted father. In this view, his family is not the source of his redemption, but the ultimate audience for his deception. We, the public, who watch his documentaries and read his story, are part of that audience as well. The truth is likely somewhere in the murky space between these two extremes. Perhaps even Bourdin himself does not fully know where the performance ends and the real person begins. After a lifetime of wearing masks, it's possible that there is no real face left underneath. His legacy is one of profound ambiguity. He is a testament to the fact that identity can be fluid, that truth can be subjective, and that some people are capable of bending reality to their will. He exposed the vulnerabilities in our systems and, more profoundly, the desperate power of human hope, which can be a source of great comfort, but also a gateway for great deception. The orphan who fooled the FBI remains a puzzle. His story is a chilling, fascinating, and deeply human chapter in the annals of crime, leaving us with the unsettling certainty that with some people, you can never truly be sure what is real. Is Frédéric Bourdin a reformed family man, or is this quiet life his most convincing performance yet? His story is a chilling exploration of identity, deception, and the unsettling possibility that some truths can never be known. It's a tale that perfectly embodies the complex human mysteries we delve into here. If you're compelled by the stories that live in the shadows, the ones that challenge everything you think you know, then subscribe to Dark Chapters and ring the bell. You won't want to miss the next page we turn. Generate audio overview.